So welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. And we have been working our way through Mind at Ease, Self-Liberation through Mahamudra Meditation by Traleg Rinpoche. And tonight we're on chapter 6, dealing with the 4 Immeasurables. So let's start by bowing in. And welcome, everyone. So these are the 4 immeasurables that we chant every day, morning and evening. May all beings enjoy happiness and the root of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the root of suffering. May they not be separated from the great happiness devoid of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free from passion, aggression, and prejudice. So these are Maitri, wishing happiness for all people. Karuna, this I'm giving you the Sanskrit, right? Which is compassion for all people, for all sentient beings, actually, not just people, including animals and gods and hell beings and everybody else. And then joy, we're wishing joy for all people. And the last one, equanimity, which actually spans the previous 3 and provides a background or a foundation for them, you might say. So we practice these. We haven't, but we're about to do it more. We've been doing it every morning, but without really reflecting on them very much. And we're going to probably start incorporating contemplations into our practice, having to do with these foundations, these 4 immeasurables, because they're so profound and transformative, really. In the reading, after describing them, he calls them meditations, and then gives us a description of how you do a meditation on each one of these things. But these aren't really meditations. Meditation we think of as shamatha and vipassana, just as a matter of terminology. English terminology, translation from the Tibetan. And these are more in what Rinpoche used to call contemplations, meaning they are conceptual in nature. And it's always best with a contemplation to start with meditation. That means clearing your mind into a non-conceptual state. And then you rouse the conceptual contemplation within that state. And at the end, you dissolve it back into that state of meditation. So these allow us, these 4 contemplations, to enter into a dialogue of compassion and wisdom with the world, instead of treating it as an object of the 3 poisons, meaning instead of treating everything that we meet as an object of passion, wanting to pull it towards us, aggression, wanting to push it away from us, or indifference, remaining the same distance because we don't care about it. Instead of that, we can rouse these 4 immeasurables in our attitude towards the phenomenal world. They're designed to have a positive effect on us, on our feelings and emotions and thoughts, versus the self-destructive, egocentric behaviors that we often engage in. All kinds of self-attack and self-abuse and self-destruction. Whether it's actually aimed at ourselves or at others, it's harmful for ourselves. And these are a counter for that. They're called, they're called the 4 immeasurables. In Sanskrit, I can't remember. Anybody remember that, Michael or Larry? I can't recall what it is. They're also called the Brahma Viharas, which is actually because these practices were done by Hindus as well. Brahma Vihara literally means the abode of Brahma. Brahma was one of the trinity of gods who rule the cosmos, Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu. Brahma was the sustainer, is the sustainer. And these are the place where Brahma dwells. And Traleg Rinpoche says that gods like Brahma represent peace and happiness, and that these meditations lead to that. The Buddha suggested that by meditating on these, we would experience immeasurable love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, the four dwellings of Brahma, the god Brahma, and that one could become divine, more like a god, which goes a little bit up against what we've learned about Buddhism. They give us the opportunity to become a special kind of being, meaning a spiritual being, transcending our familiar egoistic state, because these contemplations are all about giving up self-centeredness, ego, which is so painful. I mean, every act of ego, self-aggrandizement, is fraught with poverty mentality, a feeling of lack, wanting to improve things, a feeling of tension, anxiety. And this is all about giving that up and coming into a more natural state of appreciation for our life and our world. We think that while we may not be able to overcome suffering altogether until we attain Buddhahood, if we think about the four immeasurables, four Brahma Viharas, we will reduce our suffering and become a loving, compassionate, joyful, and stable person. And it's also connected to the skillful means, the upaya, of the Bodhisattva path, which has to do with the paramitas, the transcendent virtues. And the four immeasurables relate really more to the development of compassion, which happens on the Bodhisattva path, than the development of wisdom, which is generated through the practice of meditation, shamatha meditation, tranquility meditation, mindfulness meditation it's called, and vipassana, insight. And those two kinds of practice have more to do with the development of wisdom. These practices have to do with the development of compassion. So the first four paramitas, which are generosity, patience, transcendent, obviously, having to do with non-egotistical generosity, patience, behaving in a way that is beneficial to other human beings, and energy, virya. And these relate to the first immeasurable, love and maitri. It says practicing the four immeasurables will help our practice of the first four paramitas in real life situations. Generosity, patience, morality, it's sometimes translated as shila, meaning proper action. Proper action really means giving up ego and simply behaving with what is appropriate in the moment. And finally, energy, life, joy. Yeah, Trungpa Rinpoche preferred to translate that joy. So these first four paramitas provide us with an inexhaustible world of goodness. As we engage in this type of practice, the immeasurables, our mental stability will become strengthened, as will our flexibility of mind. And both are necessary to the spiritual journey. Without mental stability and without flexibility of mind, we're all over the place. We're unstable and we're rigid, both. He says it is only from the stirrings of emotions based on love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, the four immeasurables again, that we can gradually become a person who is loving, compassionate, joyous, well-grounded, and not given to extreme mood swings and instability. There's a strong connection between practicing these emotions in meditation and contemplation, in which we're going to do a bit of, and applying them in daily life. They inform and influence each other, meditation, and daily life. So we can practice them while we're sitting on the cushion, generating these different aspects of joy, Maitri, Karuna, joy, and Mudita, and Upeksha, which is stability. He says, in daily life, we might be limited in our application of these by circumstance, but we're completely unlimited in our application or our exercise of these four immeasurables when we practice them on the cushion in meditation. Here, our imagination is our only limitation. So we can expand our love and compassion limitlessly versus giving attention to negative, unconstructive, and unhealthy emotions which produce gloom and hatred about life. Or worse still, spiritual conceit, he says. These negative approaches will turn us into shameful, self-hating moralists. And haven't we met people who are so religious that they're shameful and self-hating moralists? I mean, in Buddhism, again and again, we're told that the number one sin, as it were, the number one crime is self-attack, self-hatred. Because when you hate yourself, you turn it around and foist it on the whole world. And so to be self-hating and shameful is not a good thing. So most people behave destructively, and this is produced by their lack of skill in managing their emotional lives. And this produces the need for practices like the four immeasurables, which train us in very practical, efficient ways of expressing ourselves. We can correct our negative and unhealthy emotions, our depressions, our resentments, our self-attack, above all, and other things. This isn't a matter of developing stoic indifference, like we're not going to care. We're just going to sort of freeze into a kind of meditative trance. This isn't that. Rather, practices such as the four immeasurables aim to modify, manage, and creatively utilize our emotional intelligence. He borrows a phrase from Danny Goleman, who is a friend of ours in the Dharma. They involve mental purification and healing through contemplation, because we become more aware of what's going on in our minds and countering it with these contemplations, developing the feelings of love, compassion, generosity, and equanimity. And this produces self-enrichment without having to dwell on our internal mental world, which so often means dwelling on the negatives. When we think about what's going on in our heads, we often are so self-critical, such as how hurt, rejected, denied of love, grief-stricken we feel, or on all our hopelessness and inadequacy, on our insecurity and anxiety about the future. All these things are so self-destructive and counterproductive, really anti-dharma. When we spend time looking back on ourselves, we always end up focusing on these negativities, and we get swept up in confusion. This never leads to answers about life's problems, but only to confusion and bewilderment. So contemplation on the four immeasurables will gradually, through this, we will gradually recognize the unconscious influences that come from our deep-seated psyche programming based on cultural and religious biases, gender differences, or individual psychic makeup that serve to limit our ability to embrace other sentient beings and feel connected and intimate with them. Through these contemplations, we become much more sensitive to these limiting factors, self-critical factors in ourselves, because they will stand in contrast to what we're contemplating. So the four immeasurables have the capacity to heal as well as to purify the mind. Our conflicting emotions and delusions will be lessened as a result of these contemplations on the four immeasurables. Our conflicting emotions and delusions will be lessened. There are dreams, in other words, or negative dreams, and we are increasingly able to see ourselves in a positive light, which we all need a lot of. Our capacity to care, share, give, and feel for others is enriched and increased by these contemplations. That's what they're all about. Feel for others and ourselves. Having love, compassion, joy, and equanimity can have a stabilizing and strengthening influence on our character and temperament. He says, in fact, the greatest quality that anyone can have is the capacity to connect with others and have a positive effect on them. I'll read that again. In fact, the greatest quality that anyone can have is the capacity to connect with others and have a positive effect on them. This produces mutual benefit for oneself and others. And so these four immeasurables are about bridging the gap between ourselves and others. Our own suffering is lessened as a result of these contemplations and our meditation. And this narrows the seemingly unbridgeable chasm that separates us from other people. So seeing ourselves as separate from others is the very essence of the samsaric trap, because then we're continually engaged in trying to bring others closer to us or pushing them away if we see them as dangerous or inimical, or ignoring them if we feel that they're of no significance to us at all. The three poisons again. So, and then he goes on about sort of a sidetrack here about that in Buddhism, the notion of a separate, autonomously existing self is imaginary. That means, the doctrine of no self, no Atman, no ego, egolessness. What that really means is that we don't exist separately. Each one of us has a unique character. This is expressed in different ways. One of the ways that you can think of this is when we get to it, if we haven't, some of you have already, the 5 Buddha families that go to describe each one of us. Vajra family, highly intellectual, negative side is anger. Ratna family, very, very enriching, negative side is greed, and so forth. And these families each have qualities of color. The Vajra family is white or blue. Ratna family is yellow, and seasons, and all of these things. And that each one of us expresses our individual uniqueness, male, female, intellectual, loving, seductive, very, very accomplishing, active, whatever it may be. Each one of us has particular talents, so we are different. And yet, we just don't exist as separate entities. We are part of this matrix that we are involved in constantly melting into our being in 24/7. And there is in any idea of self and other as being separate entities is completely imaginary, and that's what Buddhism teaches. So these contemplations dissolve these boundaries between I and other, and they begin to bring us more into the true state of existence, which is that we exist as part of a matrix in which everything is constantly interpenetrating and contributing to each other. So we aren't trying to transform ourselves, because there is no self, but rather the various character traits which we have each one of us is so unique, and dispositions that define us. And we are trying to transform these because sometimes, they're negative, sometimes they're not helpful, sometimes they're painful, and sometimes they separate us mentally from others and make us both unuseful and unhappy. He says, by focusing through others through the four immeasurables, the self will be transformed, the so-called self, without our ever having to focus exclusively or obsessively on our own well-being. In fact, what we're focusing on is others' well-being, and this transforms us from neurotic and selfish into sane and participatory and loving. So this isn't about what's doing right in some moralistic sense, but about doing what is good and valuable, both for ourselves and for others. And this contributes towards building ours and others' character. So people who engage in the practice of self-cultivation and have become enriched through dealing with themselves in relation to others will find that something truly worthwhile has developed in their character. As a result, they become people of depth and integrity. This is what the four immeasurables are meant to cultivate in us. Depth, integrity, through the cultivation of happiness, compassion, joy, and equanimity for others and ourselves. He says consideration of our own needs and the needs of others has to be kept in equal balance at all times. As a matter of fact, our own experiences will be transformed by our paying attention to the experiences of others. That means that as we begin to become more generous, aware, loving, kind to others, our lives are transformed in a very positive way. He says, as Shantideva and other Mahayana masters have pointed out, the more we concentrate on our own experiences to the exclusion of others' experiences, the more our mental agitation, frustration, and despair will increase. The more attention we pay to the experiences of others, the more we will automatically view our own experiences differently. As a result, it will become easier to be more loving than hateful, more compassionate than resentful, and more joyous than given to bouts of depression. So mind functions on two levels, and we need them both for these contemplations, the absolute and the relative. The absolute level is just pure spatial awareness of this, without any distinction being made. It's like we're resting in pure awareness without any gravitation towards this or that, good or bad, whatever. But it's just pure awareness right here in the moment. The relative truth is that within that awareness, things arise. The pink of this flesh, the sound of these words, the smell of dinner cooking on the range, the thoughts that come into our minds. These are the relative truths that describe the phenomenal world. And they all exist within this space of absolute truth, awareness. So the two go hand in hand. You have to have the absolute space of awareness because within it, it allows the arising of the relative truth, of particularity, of detail, of all the qualities of this world. And he says we will never overcome our mental afflictions until we can access the undifferentiated state of absolute truth. We need to be able to come back into this. That's why the last of the four immeasurables is equanimity. Equanimity is resting here in awareness. And we need to be practicing that as we practice these contemplations. And within that awareness, the contemplations arise as particular thoughts and emotions. This is a style of practice that you're going to encounter throughout your path. When you get to the Vajrayana, it's there again. In the way that we do visualization practices, they arise out of open space of awareness, these visualizations of whatever it may be, and then they dissolve back into it. And it's the same with these contemplations. It's the same with our lives. As we sit here, there are these two elements, awareness, and within that awareness, there is the intelligent apprehension of detail, of the relative truth, absolute and relative. The absolute truth is nothing has any true being. The relative truth is that nonetheless, within that space of non-being, details are constantly arising and passing away, just like these words. These are the two truths. And he's talking about them here. He says, we're trying to generate this all-encompassing, undifferentiated state, that's the absolute truth, through the practice of the four immeasurables, while in everyday situations maintaining our sense of discrimination. In everyday situations, you know that salt is the taste of salt, and that sugar has the taste of sweet, and that whatever it is, there's blue and red and sharp and loud and soft and all of these things. So similarly, in any given situation, this open space of a situation, we address the needs of others according to the situation and our capacities and what they need. And this has to do with the four immeasurables again, generating kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. He says it is very important to differentiate between generating love, compassion, and so forth in a contemplative state and performing acts of love and compassion in daily life. It is made very clear in the Buddhist teachings that even an enlightened being functions on the levels of both non-discrimination and discrimination, open space and particularity. They are as equally necessary conditions for functioning in the world. That is why the two levels of mind are classified as separate aspects of wisdom. Absolute truth, nothing has any true being, everything is just appearing, and relative truth, everything is appearing. There's this slogan, I've repeated it before, that you say sometimes in the beginning of tantric ceremonies, nothing exists, and yet things appear. Things appear, and yet they don't exist. And that is the statement of the absolute and relative truth. So the practices of the four immeasurables. He says we must learn to empathize with and have sympathy for others. This has a tremendously beneficial and healthy effect on us. And this requires the ability to imagine ourselves in their position, having their worries and sadness and so forth. Tremendous empathy. What an exercise. What a profound exercise. We train ourselves to develop this kind of empathy through a combination of imagination and visualization practiced repeatedly, both in retreat situations and in daily meditation at home. So, I think, Michael, were you going to pick up here, or are you going to pick up where the four immeasurables begin? The immeasurable equanimity.
With equanimity.
Okay.
Hopefully with equanimity.
Huh?
Hopefully with equanimity.
With equanimity, good. So the practice of the four immeasurables, we train ourselves through in this kind of empathy through a combination of imagination and visualization repeatedly practiced. And we begin, this is the rough description of how we do a contemplation of this sort, or he's calling them meditations. We begin by taking a meditation posture, a good one, we're all familiar with that. We close our eyes and begin a series of visualizations. First, you settle your mind in pure shamatha. This is concentrating your mind on an object. And what he's actually doing is pure shamatha. He's saying we could start with watching the breath go out and come in and go out and come in. And we imagine that all our disturbing thoughts and emotions are leaving the body with the out breath, and that peace, serenity, and a sense of spaciousness are entering your body on the in breath. This is very like Tonglen, isn't it? But it also has the very much the quality of pure shamatha, pure mindfulness practice, rather than what we do in our morning and evening meditations, which is also awareness practice. This isn't awareness. This is pure concentration on the breath going out and coming in. Then he says, think of a person that you're very fond of, and then of someone you dislike, and then of a mere acquaintance. And we're going to do this with regard to each of the four immeasurables. We're going to apply them, like, for instance, Maitri, the feeling of kindness. We're going to apply it first to someone we love, then to someone to whom we're indifferent, and finally, most difficultly, to someone that we dislike or that we feel has done us harm. These three different kinds of beings are the three objects of your practice. Each will be meditated on from the perspective of past, present, and future. So you might think of that person that you love in terms of how you've loved them in the past, how you love them now, and what's going to happen in the future, and things may change in the future. You can do all kinds of contemplation there. Then you slowly expand the visualization to include all sentient beings, which includes animals, and even other planets and even other galaxies. That's a bit of a stretch, but there you go. We divide these meditations on love, compassion, and joy, and into two aspects, with and without an object. First, we pick a person, maybe, or a sentient being, to whom we're going to send our love, or affection, or our compassion, or joy. And then eventually, towards the end of the thing, we just sit there in that emotion that we were sending out, love. Sit there in objectless love. That's the second stage. It says you can even do it to people. You can even expand the visualization of three types of people to encompass their previous lives. You might think this person whom I dislike with such passion may well have been my best friend in a previous life. And this person whom I love so intensely might have been my worst enemy in a previous life. These are different variations. So in the Buddhist teachings, there are these three components to the emotions that we're going to experience. The feeling component, which is, where does it sit in your body? What's the feeling? Is it pleasant, painful, neutral, or hot, cold, whatever it might be? The experience of the emotion itself, that hatred, and then finally the thoughts that are attached to that emotion. So for instance, if it's hatred, it's why you hate this person. If it's love, it's why you love them. We need to see all three aspects if we are to see the fixations that lie behind our emotional responses and learn to connect with others in a more compassionate way. And then finally, he says, note well, nota bene, meditation on the four immeasurables is the result. It's not like we're trying to generate love that we're going to carry around throughout the day. As we think about love, as we sit on the cushion, that is the experience of love. That is the experience of joy, whatever it may be. So you don't have to be hard on yourself and think, oh gosh, I'm going to generate something more than what's happening here right now on the cushion. As soon as you think of love, compassion, or joy within this space of awareness, which is equanimity, that's it. And I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Michael.
Yeah. So primarily the four immeasurables are Mahayana practice. However, he presents the four immeasurables in a way that really has a Vajrayana flavor. But before we get into that, which involves the meditation on immeasurable equanimity, just to say a couple of things about the Mahayana altogether. That we enter the Mahayana with the view and the intention and the practice of benefiting all sentient beings. But in fact, until we're able to relate to the world in the way that he says in the beginning, not seeing it as a reality to be rejected, resisted, or defied, we can't be free ourselves. So in fact, although our intention is not, we don't engage with the Mahayana with any sense of self-interest, or at least we work to become aware of and let go of self-interest as we work with Mahayana practice. In fact, liberation is entirely, it's a much greater sense of liberation, not only for all sentient beings, but ourselves as well. And he says this right in the beginning, when he says many of our actions are unhelpful and self-destructive because they stem directly from our unexamined egocentric attitudes. And then he says, meditation on the four immeasurables provides us the opportunity to reorient ourselves and transcend our limited, self-absorbed states of being. Sometimes Mahayana practices, such as the four immeasurables, Tonglen, the Paramitas, and there are others as well, are described as antidotes. He doesn't use that term, but when he talks about the four immeasurables as healing and purifying, in fact, that's what they are, antidotes to our egocentric states of mind, egocentric states of being. He also says about the four immeasurables that these meditations or these contemplations are designed to bring about the types of feelings, emotions, and thoughts that will have a positive effect on our character. In other words, in engaging these practices, we are making some deliberate effort to cultivate certain thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Ultimately, it's said that compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, and the sympathetic joy are inherent within us. But we need to work with these. We need to develop these. We need to bring these out. And we do this through the practice of contemplation, as well as through shamatha vipassana meditation. So he begins with the section talking about immeasurable equanimity as the first contemplation, the first of the four immeasurables that we'll practice, by saying that equanimity, or upeksha, equanimity begins with the development of a mind that is without aversion, attraction, or indifference. In other words, it's a state of mind that's free of bias for or against. It's interesting that he adds indifference here because when we actually say the chant, I think it says free from, I can't remember the exact words, but it doesn't say indifference. It's, I can't remember it right now, I'm drawing a blank, but something with prejudice. It doesn't mention indifference. In more traditional teachings, it's said that each of the four immeasurables has both a near enemy and a far enemy. And the idea of a near enemy is that it's something that looks like or seems like what we're trying to cultivate or develop, but it isn't exactly that. And the near enemy of equanimity is indifference, not caring about anyone, so that it might seem like it's free of bias, but it's not going to help us develop compassion. The far enemy is attachment and aversion. In other words, a clear bias for or against someone. So that's what we're working to develop with equanimity. It's the development of a mind that is without aversion, attraction, or indifference. And he says it's actually the most important because love, compassion, and joy that we're going to try to generate have to come from a mental state that is uncluttered by mental activity. This is the contemplative state, which he calls the natural state of being. And he says we could call this ground Mahamudra, which we'll be reading about later in the text. But natural state of being refers to the true nature of mind, the fundamental nature of mind, before reference point, before fixation, before we get caught up in all of the strategies and dreams and stories that we develop out of passion, aggression, or ignorance. In a sense, you could say this aspect of starting with equanimity is very similar to what we when we do Lojong practice and begin with the slogans for ultimate bodhicitta: regard all dharmas as dreams, contemplate the nature of unborn awareness, self-liberate, the antidote, and rest in the nature of alia. It's a similar kind of a thing where we're asked to let go and just simply be open without bias, without reference point, without any fixed point of view. And he says, without this state of mind, free of preconceptions and prejudices, our contemplations of love, compassion, and joy will be corrupted by our notions of self and other. So he's asking us to, in doing this contemplation of equanimity, to really let go and just rest in an open, spacious, undifferentiated, as we were just, state of mind, where there isn't any kind of attachment or aversion to any particular point of view, any particular reference point. And he says we generate this spacious state of mind through realizing how relationships are constantly unstable and moving as a result of shifting circumstances. So he uses the term spacious state of mind throughout these contemplations on the four immeasurables. So we could think of spacious again as an open state of mind, an awake state of mind, a present state of mind, a mind that's free of fixation, a mind that is spacious, not cluttered with hopes and fears, prejudices for or against. So equanimity, he says, is the spacious state that, again, notices the fact that relationships are always in movement. They're always changing, that nothing about them is fixed. And thus, in a hidden way, what he's really talking about here is the fact that they're characterized by shunyata, or emptiness, and that we experience this, first of all, through the experience of impermanence, that relationships aren't stable, that they change all the time, that even the people we love and have spent years with, at times we can become angry with, disappointed in, or whatever. Maybe it's only for brief moments, but if we're actually honest with ourselves, we'll see that relationships are changing, that they are not fixed, that there is no, no set character to them. And he says this open state of mind is intimately engaged with our experiences. With this awake state of mind, this undifferentiated state of mind, this spacious state of mind, open awareness, whatever we want to call it, is aware of experiences, but is not fixated on them. So in this regard, he says that the contemplation here has a dual function. And there are two things that happen through doing this contemplation on immeasurable equanimity. The first is that it will help us develop a genuine state of equanimity, a genuine state of stability where we're not swayed by circumstances, not swayed by our own hopes and fears, our own emotions, our own fixations or whatever. And that secondly, that this will result in freeing up the mind. So these are the dual purposes of the contemplation of equanimity. So with that, I think we could begin. So the first thing, as he said, is to settle the mind in tranquility meditation, which means, again, taking a good posture, upright, straight back, but at the same time relaxed. Take a moment just to settle into our bodies, bring mind and body together so that we're all in one place, here and now. And if it helps, we can work with the breath, each breath being now. We can just out breath, let go, dissolve, and just settle. So as we settle into awareness, he says that if we begin these practices from a genuinely calm state of mind, the appropriate emotions will arise without having to generate them. And so with the practice of equanimity, we begin by meditating on a loved one. Think of someone that we're particularly close to, have a deep positive connection with, attachment to, and actually bring that person to mind. visualize them, see them. This is a practice of imagination and visualization. And then think about past and future relationship. Perhaps at one point in time that person was a non-entity to you, and then became an acquaintance, and now is someone that you are very fond of. Imagine that this person may not remain a friend in the future, at least for moments. Contemplate the changing circumstances that might adversely affect your relationship with that person. And notice how your feelings can move from deep affection and fondness to perhaps indifference and aversion. Meditating in this way allows us to develop a shift in how we view others, including those who we hold dear. We develop a greater appreciation for the fact that the individual in question is not some kind of self-existent being. Instead, who we think the person is and what he or she means to us is greatly affected by our changing circumstances, as well as the changing circumstances of the relationship. Next, perform the same meditation in relation to someone for whom we feel intense dislike. Visualize someone who is a constant thorn in your side, and deliberately make all the person's unpleasant attributes vividly clear. Think about the person you dislike in relation to the past. They may have been someone who was initially insignificant to us, or may actually have been a close friend. Then think about the person in relation to the present, and move into the future and imagine further changing circumstances. For example, that person might move to a different city or country and become insignificant to us once again. Or the person become an ally, perhaps because you're brought together by a common enemy. Then the third step is to imagine someone with whom we're unfamiliar or have no definite opinion. And think of that person in relation to his or her past and future. Perhaps in the past that person was a friend, but due to shifting pattern and circumstances has drifted away from us and now hardly features in our life at all. Think of examples of how changing circumstances, and imagine that this person has become your friend again, or perhaps become an adversary through a different set of conditions. So again, to step out for just a moment, this is the other way in which we come to realize through this meditation on equanimity how relationship, the other person and ourselves are really characterized fully by shunyata or emptiness, in addition to the situation being changing and impermanent. It's also interdependent, that it's a set of changing circumstances, changing causes and conditions that determine whether someone is friend, foe, or a mere acquaintance, or even insignificant to us. and that this changes all the time, that it's not fixed in any solid way. Or, as Traleg says, this exercise is meant to help us understand that what makes someone a friend, an adversary, or insignificant to us is contingent on multitudinous external factors. So multitudinous external factors is another way of saying causes and conditions. So that's another way of coming to understand emptiness or shunyata in the situation. There is nothing preset in terms of our relationships, and this uncertainty means that all kinds of possibilities can and probably will arise. When we really understand this to be true, we can view all these possibilities with whatever degree of equanimity we can muster. So he goes on to say that this does not mean that with equanimity, or later he talks about stability, it doesn't mean that everything remains on an even keel. It just means that as we come to understand and accept this, that we're less thrown by the ups and downs of life, that we'll always be experiencing changing circumstances. Sooner or later, everything changes, everything's impermanent. But by coming to meditate on equanimity, we develop a sense of stability, even-handedness in relation to how we relate to people and relate to things. So with the contemplation of equanimity, the idea ultimately is to develop, again, a state of mind where we realize that any kind of bias for or against it just comes about because of temporary circumstances. And we begin to see the emptiness of any fixation we might have in regard to friend, enemy, or even who might be insignificant to us. We could look at these three types of situations in regard to passion, aggression, and ignorance, which is what develops when we relate to the world from the point of view of any kind of dualistic notion of I and other. And as we meditate on the changing nature of things and the interdependent nature of things, we begin to let go of fixation. So with that, we can move on to the second immeasurable, the immeasurable love, which again involves learning to experience the fundamentals of a loving feeling. It says loving kindness is an emotion that's not compromised or diluted by other conflicting emotions or feelings. It's pure. And in particular, love in this context is defined quite simply as wanting someone to be happy. And if we think about the people that we really love, when we experience love for them, that is what we want. We want the people we love to be happy. And again, he says with this, as with the other contemplations, that the most important aspect of this is, of this practice, is the feelings and emotions that we generate. And again, in terms of the notion of a near and far enemy, the near enemy of loving kindness, Maitri, this next contemplation that we'll do, is variously defined as sentimentality or some kind of conditional love, which he'll talk about in regard to attachment. But that the far enemy, in other words, or you could say what it works to heal and purify, is any sense of ill will, any sense of wishing for harm or that negative circumstances befall someone, rather than wishing that that beings be happy. So we can do the contemplation on immeasurable love. And again, we begin by developing a sense of equanimity, open-mindedness, a spacious state of mind, awake. And then, as before, we generate love to three types of people. And we begin with someone who we're close to, someone we have a positive feeling about, someone that we have a loving relationship with. The Mahayana is very much about beginning with what's easy and working to more difficult situations. So we begin by visualizing, thinking about someone who we love, someone who we would want to be happy, someone for whom we wish happiness. And as we visualize this person, we should think, what would make this person happy? What do they desire or need to be physically, mentally, and spiritually level and happy? It could be material things. It could be the restoration of health. It could be finding a lost love, or perhaps something more like discovering some kind of meaning in life. Whatever it is, whatever we think this person desires or needs, we should imagine vividly that this person who we're sending love has received the fulfillment of whatever it is that they desire or need, and is positively affected by our love and generosity. To really feel that this person for whom we wish happiness has what they need, has what they would like, and that they're happy and joyous. And then he says we should return to the practice of equanimity, let go. He says we can arouse strong feelings in this practice, and equanimity is a way to keep us from being swept away by unrestrained emotions. So we come back to equanimity, back to a settled state of mind, or allow ourselves to settle. And then we move on to visualizing, imaging someone who is an acquaintance or even a stranger, a neutral person is visualized next, because again, it's easier to generate love to someone that we're indifferent toward, as opposed to the more challenging situation of generating love to someone who we dislike. But visualize a person, a stranger, but someone that we know. It could be a clerk at the grocery store. It could be someone else we see on a bus or a train. Someone we just pass by on the street. A neighbor, perhaps. And visualize that person, whoever it is, and think about what might make this person happy, physically, mentally, spiritually. And again, imagine that whatever he or she desires and dreams about is fulfilled as a result of the love we're sending out. Picture that person enveloped by love and receiving the full benefit of it. And then again, return to a state of equanimity. Settle. And now, think of someone who we dislike. Imagine wanting this person to be happy and to have everything that he or she needs. If our dislike has arisen from perceiving this person to be aggressive or arrogant, imagine that this aggressive nature has mellowed and softened, and that he or she is becoming happier. Or if arrogant, that becoming more humble, more open, less aggressive to us or others, or whatever characteristic that we might find that we dislike. Imagine that the person is relieved of the suffering and the struggle that that characteristic causes. Imagine them fulfilled, happy, or joyous. And then we can expand this to include all sentient beings, all that we know, all that we don't know, in the city, country, world, beings in the past, beings in the future. Imagine that all these beings are happy, fulfilled, have what they desire, have what they need. And then again, return to a state of equanimity, relax, and generate a loving state without thinking of any specific individual or any kind of object of love. This is what he talked about in terms of loving kindness meditation without an object, as opposed to the practice that we just did, this loving kindness meditation with an object. We just rest in the feeling of loving kindness toward ourselves, toward all beings, and imagine that we're generating an all-pervasive, radiating love, and then just rest in that state of being, which he says is ground Mahamudra. So moving on, he says that it's really critical to understand how love can be diluted by excessive attachment or possessiveness. This is the conditional love that is the near enemy of true loving kindness, Maitri. And he points out that according to Buddhism, attachment interferes with our capacity to truly care for others. And he's not talking here about the kind of attachment that children have to parents, where it actually is necessary, but talking about attachment that we might experience in our, as adults. He says true affection and true caring can be separated from attachment. Attachment implies that we have a need to be affixed to the object of our care, whether it's a thing, person, or idea, for our own security. So the fundamental basis of this is fear. So this is a sense in which, through contemplating and working with this practice, we actually can purify or let go of ego-centered, self-centered ways of relating to compassion, love, and so on, that can actually bring up some of the ways in which our love is not pure. He goes on to say that Buddhist teachings have never said that non-attachment means we should have no affection, nor has it said that we will gradually have fewer and fewer emotions until we transcend any kind of emotional experience whatsoever. In other words, we're not going to become Vulcans, Mr. Spock, and be completely logical beings. That's not the point of Buddhist practice. The teachings say that as our understanding of emotions and feelings for others increase, we'll realize that they're always moving and changing. In other words, through the practices that we do, shamatha vipassana and these contemplations of the four immeasurables, through Tonglen practice, which is a very close cousin, that we develop emotional awareness, that we experience emotion, whatever we might feel, within awareness, so that we're not controlled by the emotions. Whatever anger, passion we might feel, we're aware of what we're feeling. And so we have some choice about how we express that emotion, and we're not controlled by the emotion. This, he says, also as well, that detached love does not equate with lack of heart. It indicates a withdrawal of selfish motivations and possessiveness. Aware of time, and I want to just probably speed up just a little bit. But so immeasurable compassion, or karuna, is the next of the immeasurables, and the basic definition of compassion here is the desire to alleviate suffering. May all beings be free of suffering and the root of suffering. And we practice this to develop an all-pervasive compassion to all beings. And he says we should be careful to avoid allowing compassion to degenerate into sentimentality or gushing emotionalism. Traditionally, it's said that the near enemy of compassion is pity, where we feel sorry for someone else, but from a position of not really connecting, being somehow higher or separate. The far enemy is cruelty, actually engaging in actions that cause suffering, that bring about suffering. So we'll, just to say a little bit more, we'll skip that visualization, but basically it's similar to the visualization on love, except in this case we imagine beings being free of suffering, starting with someone who's close to us, someone who's suffering would really, we really feel because we feel connected with them, to someone who's a stranger or an acquaintance, and then finally to someone we actively dislike. And he says it's important to remember that all these meditation practices should be taken within this spacious state of mind. Again, this boundless, open, awake state of mind that comes from the meditation on equanimity. Otherwise, we can get caught up in all kinds of self-deception. But if we have the spacious state of mind, if we experience the spacious state of mind that comes from equanimity, there's room for also for a genuine self-love and self-caring that's not narcissistic and that does not fill our own egoistic needs for attention and self-nurturing. And he makes it very clear here that love for others and love for oneself have to be related, that people who hate themselves can never love someone else, and that self-hatred in itself is a destructive fixation and one of the root causes of our emotional problems. He'll also say at the end of the chapter that beginning the contemplations with equanimity is one way of practicing the four immeasurables, but traditionally in the Mahayana, they actually begin with meditation on Maitri, or loving kindness. And this is precisely why. The idea is that we include ourselves as object of love. We include ourselves as object of compassion, that we don't exclude ourselves as the one single sentient being that we don't express love and compassion for. And that, in fact, having a sense of loving kindness toward ourselves is one of the bases for developing all of these immeasurables. But the next one that he talks about is immeasurable joy, which he describes as a feeling of upliftedness that we should generate slowly in meditation. And he says we have to be predisposed to feeling like a relatively cheerful person and not given to bouts of depression or self-loathing. To be that kind of person, we have to first create and generate the feeling of joy and then habituate ourselves to it through repeated practice. So we could think about what we experience in meditation and how meditation experiences bring about or connect with a sense of joy. And there are different things that might come to mind if we really contemplate that alone, that sometimes in meditation we just have a general sense of well-being. Ultimately, meditation is supposed to bring about a feeling of bliss, but we could just start with a sense of well-being, a sense of relaxation, a sense of letting go, a feeling of being less encumbered, less pressured by our minds and by our experiences. We could experience a sense of joy in just simple appreciation of the beauty of the moment. We could experience joy in our contemplation of the precious human birth, that we can actually do something with ourselves and that we come to understand our situation is workable. But in any case, he really emphasizes the importance of having a sense of joy, or Trungpa Rinpoche used to call cheerfulness. It's interesting here that the near enemy of this practice of joy is hypocrisy, kind of a false sense of joy, and that the far enemy is envy or jealousy. As he says, it doesn't mean that having a joyous disposition doesn't mean we won't experience pain or discomfort, but we may experience these things, but nothing will be so bad as to make us feel helpless and without hope. From a Buddhist point of view, feeling helpless and or unmotivated, feeling that we're without hope, is another extreme form of egotism. That self-loathing, feeling bad about ourselves, and being harsh are all expressions of egocentricity. And he also talks a little bit about the dangers of elation, that we may feel elated sometimes, but that's not the same as joy. We shouldn't mistake that for real joy. Then in terms of making progress with the four immeasurables, I think it really emphasizes the degree to which these practices act as antidotes to our egocentric feelings, perceptions, points of view, behaviors. If we meditate on love, our anger, aggression, and hostility will decrease. If we meditate on compassion, our attachment, greed, and neediness will start to diminish. If we meditate on joy, our experience of envy and jealousy will be reduced. The meditation on equanimity acts as a corrective for conceit, egocentricity, and selfishness. And he also says that instead of getting rid of overwhelming desire, aggression, and so on, we find that these just naturally dissipate through meditation on the four immeasurables. That their power diminishes as we become more accustomed to these emotions of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And that the meditation on equanimity in particular is really an exercise in learning how to let go of our fixations. As he said in chapter 3, all of life's problems come in large part from our habit of fixating on things as being real, and then developing feelings and patterns of behavior around those things that we take to be real. But if that spaciousness exists, emotional intelligence will arise automatically because this intelligence arises from the lessening of these fixations. Our vision has become so narrowly focused, in other words, not spacious. Our vision has become so narrowly focused that we miss almost everything that is going on, and our emotional intelligence becomes dimmed and distorted. So, I think I'll stop there so we have a little bit of time for discussion and questions. There's quite a bit in this chapter. It's rich, I would say. But if all you got out of it is that the four immeasurables would be a good thing to do, then you got the point.
Yeah, I think we're going to start including them in morning meditation, contemplation each day, perhaps.
Philip?
Sure. Thank you both very much. This was a great chapter and it's full of stuff. One of the things I really enjoyed was the notion that life is nothing but constant motion, and yet it's permeated with stability, which is a kind of learning to be comfortable and to live with that unending motion. And so I was thinking about examples of that in my life, and I thought of sailing, for instance, or skiing, both things which I once thought you would just relax into it. And on some level you do, but really it's like unceasing attention and constant change. And yet that's the delight of it. That's that's the thing that remains constant through it, that nothing is constant ever. Hard to put it into words, like so much stuff in Buddhism. But I love this chapter because so many things seem to come together, and life seemed to come together with those notions. Constant change with an underlying stability, which was just an ease and joy and love of that, and acceptance of that.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking of stability in terms of, I think it was in the Shambhala, the Sacred Path of the Warrior, but it may have been somewhere else, where he talks about practice as being like riding a horse, and that we try to keep our seat, but things are changing all the time, but we maintain a sense of awareness. We maintain a sense of being present, even though circumstances change all the time. We keep our seat. Judith?
You're muted, Judith. There you go.
Hey, Philip, that was terrific. That really brought this whole idea into focus for me. Thank you so much, and thank you, John and Michael. It's something easy to relate to in those two particular instances, skiing and sailing. It's true, but focus. I think that's the underlying thing in skiing and sailing. You have to be with the moment in order to really be with it with those sports. Thank you. Yeah.
particularly like the way in which these contemplations challenge us, so that you might particularly challenging would be to practice loving kindness for a person who has hurt you, who has been your enemy, and to imagine, different things about them, like what happened in a past life or an earlier part of this life, and what may happen in the future. These contemplations go against my habitual patterns of thinking about people. Enemies are particularly provocative as an object of contemplation, but even loved ones, because you can wind up contemplating how things can go wrong, how things have gone wrong, how you can correct them. All these different contemplations which challenge our habitual patterns and lead us into new ways of thinking. And I particularly like, Michael, what you said, I hadn't really put it together, that Trungpa Rinpoche's constant emphasis on cheering up is really the third contemplation, the third immeasurable, joy. And he was always telling us, please cheer up. and how all the different ways that we might accomplish that. I think that doing these contemplations with a little help from Traleg, and perhaps others, could be really interesting as a way to start our meditation practices in the morning. Maybe different people here would volunteer to lead a contemplation one day. Very short. They can be like 5 minutes. That.
Jane?
You're muted, Jane.
I appreciate how actually doing the visualizations together with kind of guided visualizations made them really more concrete for me. But while I was doing them, I kept thinking that I'm constantly, in order to bring people closer or contemplate the way I've been with people at different times and ages of my life, implies a lot of judging. And I try not to judge in this way. And so I was a little torn about whether it's someone I, love or indifferent or has hurt me or I don't wish well. I'm constantly judging. And I try not to do that. So I felt a little incongruity in this exercise.
My feeling is that's actually part of the practice, that when he talks about these contemplations being purifying and healing, sometimes they bring up things that we're not aware of, and that part of the purifying, if you want to call it that, is becoming aware of that and being able to let go, or at least see it. And then, as he said, toward the end of the chapter, he talks about, rather than feeling like we need to change things, just allowing them to dissipate.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing that they're impermanent as well.
Okay.
So,
that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. Makes sense.
So you were actually doing it whether you knew it or not.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
That's how it's worked for me. Sometimes it's like, I'm almost like, well, it's supposed to do this, and yet what's coming up is the opposite. But I realize that that's part of working it through.
Yeah, and there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I one of the people has been my friend for 66 years, and we've led very separate lives. But I don't think there's been, except maybe during COVID, a week when we haven't spoken or been together. in 60 years. It's quite a wonderful, wonderful relationship. And I mean, it overlaps with some. There's a lot of overlap in the three, in characterizing people that you are close to, or not, or don't want to be, or want to be. So it's, I don't know. I see it as all maybe one thing.
Well, I think that's one of the points, is that it's not fixed. And seeing is also quite powerful.
Right.
It also helps, at least for myself, and Trungpa Rinpoche certainly encouraged us to have some sense of humor about our experiences in these things, that that we aim in one direction and sometimes experience something that maybe we get judgmental about or whatever, and that actually have some humor about that.
And what you said at the very end about it all going back to beginning with love and kindness, I believe that's at the core.
I find these things challenging as well. The idea of contemplating my enemy and wishing that person loving kindness. The idea of contemplating someone I love and imagining past, present, and future with this, how it started, how it's happening, what could happen in the future. I mean, it could go wrong in the future, and imagining that. And, sending the different immeasurables, to that person. I find these things very challenging, and to my preconceptions, my habitual ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, we probably should go at 7:00. Whoops. So who's doing the chants?
Me.
Shani. Okay, Shani, I'll put them up and you'll lead us. Hope people come to the discussion tomorrow. Here we go. I'm going to mute all.
We'll close by a prayer for peace and it.
Sorry, Shani, unmute yourself.
We'll close by a prayer for peace and in dedication merit to the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and no other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May he defeat enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
I'd like to encourage people who are interested to volunteer to lead a contemplation. Maybe Michael and I will start off tomorrow or the next day, and then each one of you who would like to lead it would be great. The contemplation on one of the 4 immeasurables as he directs, as he describes. So there are lots of people here who could do it. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Everybody.
John.